Evening. It's very nice to be back at your school. I taught for 32 years at the Washington School. I've been connected with the school for over 45 years, but I took 4 classes from 1st grade to 8th grade. And one of the things I know is that I'm just a slow learner. Things surprise me. It's just amazing how long it takes me to get something. And I remember an important lesson I learned from the students I taught. It came at the end of my 3rd class, and they were in 8th grade at the time. And at our school, we had an interesting tradition for Halloween. You could come dressed as any character that you were going to hear about in the school year or in a past school year. So in 5th grade, they could come dressed from someone like from ancient Egypt or Greece, and in 6th grade, they could be Romans or something from geometry or business math. But in 8th grade, because they know that they will have studied all of history, they could come dressed as anything they wanted. And you can imagine they love that possibility. And so 8th grade Halloween, it was always an adventure, just an adventure to see what they would come dressed as. And at our school, everyone would come to the stage 1 grade at a time. So the 8th graders were standing there, and I looked at one of the girls in my class, and she was wearing this lovely little dress, kind of dress that a 10-year-old would wear, and she had a little basket with her bunny, and she had on ruby red Doc Martens. And that was when I knew she'd come as Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz. And at that moment, it was like the light went on. I thought, oh my gosh, I get it. Being a teacher at the Waldorf School is like being in The Wizard of Oz, right? Because you get those children, and they're all teeny with those high voices. They're like little munchkins when they come in, right? And they sing like the Lollipop Kids sing, right? With a little squeaky voice. And they're so good, and they follow you everywhere, like you're on the yellow brick road. They'll just go with you. And then they treat the teacher like you're the all-knowing, omniscient Oz. So in 1st grade, they'd come up to me and they'd say something like, you know, Benjamin took my stick. I left it on that tree yesterday at the end of recess, and it's my stick, and he has it, and he won't give it to me. And then I'd look at them and I'd say, okay, have Benjamin come over. And then I'd look at my watch and I'd say, Benjamin, you can play with the stick for 15 minutes, and then I'll call you, and then you have to give the stick back to Jeffrey. And they were fine. It's like the all-knowing Oz had spoken and everything was good, right? They just accepted that. And it stayed that way in this wonderful, euphoric way until about 3rd or 4th grade. And that's where we got to that part of the story where the grumpy trees are. You know, where they pick the apple from the tree and the tree slaps them back and says, how would you like it if somebody did that to you? And that's what happens with the 9-year change. The children just aren't as friendly as they used to be. And then in 6th grade, it was like the evil monkeys came into the classroom, right? With the birth of critical thinking, we had backbiting and gossip and little cliques forming. And then in 7th grade, it was like when they were in that big field of poppies, right, where everybody gets sleepy. My 7th graders yawned more in my face than I would have ever wanted them to do. And I was continually saying, please pick your head up off the desk, right? The only thing that would wake my children up, just like in The Wizard of Oz, was snow. If it snowed back east and there was a possibility that we would have a late opening tomorrow, they were wide awake. And it might not be a school day tomorrow, they were all on alert, right? And then in 8th grade, you get to the land of Oz. And that's where they find out that you're really not the all-knowing Oz. You're just some man behind a curtain pulling levers with a lot of smoke. And somebody says, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. And they don't. They really don't. Right? And then they really want to complain. They, you know, like the scarecrow, they said, you know, I came all this way to see you because I wanted to get a brain. And the Tin Man, I came all this way to get a heart. And then the Cowardly Lions, you know, I came here to get courage. And then, of course, Dorothy came to go home, back to Kansas. And And so they feel like they've been let down. And they say, but you know, children, if you come to the Waldorf school, this is exactly what you're getting. Because our school is designed to develop those three capacities that those three characters in The Wizard of Oz were seeking. It's going to develop your capacity of thinking that the Scarecrow sought. It's going to develop your deep feeling that the Tin Man sought. And it's going to develop your courage, your resilience, the quality of willpower, which the Cowardly Lion sought. And Dorothy we'll speak about later. Okay? But those three capacities, they're at the heart of Waldorf education. That's what our schools are designed to develop in our children: thinking, feeling, and willing. That's what Rudolf Steiner set in motion when he designed that first Waldorf school. Now, Steiner had a reason for what he did. He was worried. He was worried about the state of the world. World War I had just ended. Germany was financially bankrupt. Inflation had made people's money worthless. There was hunger. There was social chaos. There was a Bolshevik revolution in Russia. And what was clear was that conventional thinking, modern thinking, was failing. And Steiner thought, we need another way to educate children. Now, I want to read a statement to you. It's one that interests me. So I ask for your patience as I read this. Humankind has inherited much from past generations that contemporary life calls into question. Thus, the numerous current crises and demands of our time. How many such matters occupy the world's attention? Social questions, questions of human rights, women's issues, health issues, and so on. Human beings endeavor to come to terms with these problems in the most varied ways. So, social issues, human rights, women's issues, health issues. These are issues that we face today. This statement was written by Rudolf Steiner in 1907. It still applies. And what he felt and went on to say was that looking at these things in life with deeper vision, one can feel, indeed the impression forces itself upon one, that our contemporaries are in a position of trying to meet the demands of modern life with completely inadequate methods. And I'd have to say that it must be true that it was inadequate if the problems are still here 100 years later. We really have not solved these problems. And then he went on to say, but those who make proposals for the future cannot be satisfied with only a superficial view of life. We must look more deeply. And that was where he brought a spiritual perspective to the founding of our Waldorf schools. And that spiritual perspective was based on an understanding that children in their development go through three distinct stages of development: birth to 7, 7 to 14, 14 to 21. And that in each of those phases, the child transitions from one phase to the other. They become markedly different than they were in the phase previous. And that difference requires that they be educated differently. So we work with the preschool child in a very different way than we work with the grade school child. And we work with the grade school child in a very different way than we work with the adolescent. And that's at the heart of Waldorf education, that we understand this developmental journey of our children. And what we know is that there's an accent in each of those stages. So from birth to 7, the children are primarily active. You know that if you have a little one, because if you follow them around, they'll exhaust you, right? Because their energy and activity is endless. They're like the Energizer Bunny. They just like keep going, right? Now, when they're in that active phase, what we know is that what we do in the presence of those children matters. Actions speak louder than words to the young child. They pay attention to what adults do. We teach them by what we do in their presence because they imitate what they see. And the reason they imitate is because innately little children believe the world is good. And they believe that everything they see is worthy. So they don't stop and say, well, my mother's not having her best day today. I won't repeat that word she just said. Right? Or my father's not at his best right now. I will not do what he just did. Right? Because they don't have a buffer. Because they believe it's all good. And so we want a school that recognizes how open our young children are when they come to us in preschool. How they take everything in. And we want them to express their activity through play. And play is something that is losing popularity in our mainstream schools. In fact, if I were to look at a mainstream kindergarten, I would notice immediately that the play equipment that I grew up with is now gone from those classrooms. There aren't those little wooden stoves and tables and chairs and things where you can play house, and there aren't play kitchens, and there just aren't a lot of toys because we've given our kindergarten over to paper and pencil work in our effort to educate our children academically. But what we've lost sight of is that play is the basis for creative thinking. And if we want our children to grow up to be the kind of creative thinkers that can solve the complex problems that are part and parcel of our world, they need to be educated for creative thinking. And play does that. We had an exhibit at the Smithsonian a number of years ago that was entitled Play and the Life of Geniuses. And they just detailed how people like Einstein, through their playfulness, were able to make the discoveries that changed our world. How Alexander Humboldt, no? Well, I won't remember his name. He was a gentleman who discovered penicillin. The way he discovered it was because he loved to paint in petri dishes. He would grow molds of different colors and use them to paint while he was working in the lab. So he would playfully create these designs and paintings. Well, he had this blue mold that he continually kept growing. Turned out to be penicillin. And it was his playfulness that led him to that discovery. Play engenders divergent thinking. That's what creative people have. It's the ability to see that there's not just one answer to a question, not one answer to a problem. We mislead our children when we give them multiple choice tests, because we're giving them the impression that if you look carefully at A, B, C, or D, you're going to find the answer to this problem. I assure people that where I come from, Washington, D.C., we have intelligent people in government. If it were just intelligence that would solve problems, and if it was just A, B, C, or D, they would have answered it by now. But the sense you're left with is that we're still not even asking the right questions. And so how do we educate children for creative intelligence? We do it through play. Divergent thinking is fostered even by the toys we put in a preschool. So for instance, when I would go into my wife's kindergarten classroom, there was one piece of play equipment that just fascinated me. It was a piece of wood that looked like the outer edge of a tree. It was just a curved piece of wood. And the children would use that piece of wood in so many different ways. Some children would turn it over till it was like a little bowl, and they'd put acorns in it, and when they played house, they would go from one friend to another, offering them imaginary food. Other children would take that and they'd set it on the ground, and they'd walk little animals over it as if it were a bridge. And then other children would take it and hold it to their ear and touch it and say, "No, I'm sorry, she's not here right now." Right? Because it could be so many different things, and that divergent thinking is really at the heart of creativity. That's one of the key aspects that our Waldorf students have. They have creative minds from the education. The other thing that play does is it creates focus. Children, when they play, are completely one with what they're doing. That's why it's so hard to get them to go from play to the dinner table, because they are just so involved. That is also an aspect of creative endeavors. The geneticist Barbara McClintock, who won the Nobel Prize for her work with the DNA of corn, her genetic research, she said that when she was doing research on corn molecules, looking through the microscope, she felt as if she was right down on the slide. And the more she looked at it, the bigger the chromosomes became. And that's being in the zone. That's the kind of attention that young children bring to play. We want them to have that single-minded focus, because that's what creative individuals have. There's another story about Barbara McClintock. She was in college and she was taking a geology test, and she just loved rocks. And they gave her the blue book to answer the questions, and she wrote and she wrote and she wrote, and she was so involved in her answer that when it came time to put her name on the blue book, she couldn't remember her name. And isn't that what we all long for? Don't we long to forget ourselves? To do something new without thinking about why? Just to do it. To be so involved that we forget where we are and who we are, because we're so immersed. Children have that gift. We need to protect it in education. That's a life gift. It's a treasure. We should safeguard it and not undo it through the schooling that they get. The third thing about play that's really convincing to me is an understanding that came from a book I read, very unusual book. It was called Geeks and Geezers, and it was put out by the Harvard Business School. And the two authors of the book, what they wanted to research was, are there any similarities between business leaders from post-World War II industrial business with the dot-com leaders of the 90s? And they didn't find what they expected. It wasn't anything to do with family structure or the family's education or anything like that. But what they found was that the business leaders in both industrial and in dot-com, they were youthful. They were playful. And their playfulness led them to their innovations. And not only were they playful, but they found that their playfulness kept them young. The example they give is Frank Gehry, the architect, the Canadian architect. In his late years, in his 70s, he still ice skated. He played cutthroat ice hockey. I just find that charming, a delight to think. I mean, I know people in their late 70s that won't even go out of the house if there's ice. Don't you love it when someone of that age is adventurous? When their world doesn't shrink, when they're still learning and it's new and they're youthful. That quality biologists call neoteny, the ability of a species to keep youthfulness alive in old age. Isn't that what we all want for our children? Isn't that what we want for ourselves? We want to preserve that youthfulness by allowing our children to play in preschool. We let them play in grade school too, not as much, but that self-directed free play is at the heart of sound intelligence. And our preschool programs are committed to that. And it's worthy. It's a really worthy undertaking. So that resilience and will activity, what the powder milk biscuit commercials used to call the strength to get up and do what needs to be done, that starts in preschool. That's the development of will, learning by doing, learning through doing, and watching others do. When our children transition to grade school, something else comes in. It comes in because that immediacy of their connection, the one that makes them imitate so effortlessly, that dissipates a little. And they distance themselves ever so slightly from the world they see. And when they distance themselves, their feeling is kindled. And they start to feel deeply. And now in grade school, it's not just what someone does in a child's presence that matters, but what we feel and how we touch their feelings. We call the grade school the heart of childhood, and we educate children through feeling. Now, when I taught first grade, every time I took a first grade, there was a story that I would tell to the children in my class on the first day of school. It was about a little boy who's out playing with his sister, and the mother opens the door of their house and calls the sister and says, "I need you to come here. I need you to take your brother to the shoemaker and tell the shoemaker to make him a pair, please, to make him a pair of straight and curved." And the little girl looks at her brother, and she looks at his bare feet, and she knows if he's starting school, he cannot go to school barefoot. So she takes him by the hand, and they walk down the street, and they go to the shoemaker's shop. They open the door, and the little bell above the door rings, and the shoemaker, who's a little grumpy, is there behind the counter, and the children experience all the smells of a shoemaker shop. The leather and the glues, and there's the shoemaker with his leather apron. He looks up over his glasses and he says, "Yes." And the little girl gets up her courage and she says, "My mother says, would you please make my brother a pair of straight and curved?" And the shoemaker looks and he says, "Yes, go sit over there." And they go to that little seat. You know, remember those, maybe you don't because you're not as old as I am, but they had those little, they're like little stools that part of it goes down and you put your foot on it and they measure the size of your foot. Well, the shoemaker brings out two pieces of leather. One's a very stiff piece of leather, and he puts that under the sole of the child's foot, and he sketches the shape of the foot, and then the other foot. And then he has a supple, soft piece of curved leather. He puts that over the instep and marks the outline of the foot. And then he says to the child, "Now you go home with your sister, you come back in 2 days, and your straight and curve will be done." So little boy leaves, and he's delighted to get out of there. And he goes home to play, and 2 days later, he has to come back with his sister. And the whole scene repeats itself with the bell and the smells and the shoemaker. And he says, "Oh, your shoes are ready. Go sit down." The little boy sits down. The shoemaker comes out with 2 brand new shoes. And they put them on the boy, tie the laces, and the boy does what every child does, walks looking at his feet as he walks to try them out. And he's all ready to leave when the shoemaker says, "No, wait. You're going to start first grade tomorrow, and there's something you must see. Come back behind the counter." He takes him behind the counter, and there he shows him a box of old, worn-out shoes. And the worn-out shoes, the uppers have torn away from the soles, and they have big holes in them. They look like gaping mouths. And the little boy's a little frightened. And he pulls back, and the shoemaker says, no, look at these and remember, these shoes have not been sewed together well. Straight and curved has not been sewn together well. You must sew straight and curved together carefully in all you do. And that's what he tells the boy. And that's what I've told the children in my first grade. Because to me, that picture epitomizes the essence of the grade school education. I'm going to try to sew straight and curved together in the way that I teach the children. I'm going to try to develop both sides of their brain. I'm going to try to develop their intellect as well as their intuition. I'm going to try to develop their cognitive as well as their affective intelligence. And I'm going to try to sew it together so that it's not separate and disconnected, that it's all interwoven to make them whole people, so that they can think with warmth, and that their thinking will be dynamic and active, and their activity will be thoughtful, that it all will merge into an integrated whole. Now the question is, what does that look like in the classroom? The blending of straight and curved. The best example I can give you is from a lesson that I taught in 4th grade. And in 4th grade, the curriculum asks the teachers to explore a study of the human being and the animal kingdom. And 4th graders love animals, so it's a favorite block. And one of the animals that we teach is the eagle. It's an archetypal animal. And what I wanted to do was to use a lesson from another teacher that I had read about. There was a teacher in New York City called Dorothy Harrer. She taught at the Rudolph Steiner School in Manhattan. And she was just an excellent teacher, and they probably begged her to please write down the lessons because what you've done is so good. And so she had about 3 or 4 books that came out. One on nature studies, one on English teaching, one on math, one on history. And this one, in the nature studies, she had a story about the eagle that I wanted to use. But I needed a way to get my children's attention, because getting children's attention is as important as it is hard. And this day I knew that I had an in. I wanted to ask them a question. I wanted to ask them a 4th grade question. I said, who are the fastest children in our class? You may not know this, but 4th graders divide the world into groups. That's why we teach them fractions. They know the fastest, they know who draws the best, they know who's the strongest. They just know, they've figured that all out. They've compartmentalized everything. That's what 4th graders do. So they had their opinions, and their hands went up, and they all said quickly, all right, Nathan's the fastest in the class. I said, are you sure? They said, oh yes. They were sure. My class never agreed on anything, but they agreed about that. Who's second fastest? Oh, Adia's the second fastest. She's almost as fast as Nathan, but not quite. I said, okay. And who's the third fastest? They said, Cameron. He was a new boy in the class. They already knew this about him. He was the third fastest. So I said to them, okay, how long do you think it'll take Nathan to run from our classroom window across the playground, touch the fence on the other end, and back? And one child raised their hand and said, 57 seconds. And then somebody else said, are you kidding? It won't take him that long. 23 seconds. And then somebody said, no, that's too quick. 35 seconds. And that's where they got into their real element, where they argued about all the different opinions. They're very strong-minded, opinionated children. And so we said, okay, I know how to solve this. And this is where I knew my lesson would get interesting. I said, Nathan, open the window and climb out the window. Right, we're on the 1st floor, so it's not dangerous. He climbed out the window. And then I said, okay, who has a watch with a timer? There's always a 4th grade child with one of those watches, right? So we had one of those. I said, when I say go, you time him, Daniel. Nathan, you're going to run across the blacktop, touch the fence, and run all the way back. He did. 32 seconds. Then Adia got to climb out the window, and she ran 35 seconds. And then Cameron went, climbed out the window, and he ran 37 seconds. And then I disappointed all the other children in the class because we stopped then. Nobody else got to climb out. And I said, okay, now, can you think of a way that you could get to that fence and back more quickly than Nathan? And this boy in the front, Stefan, his hand went right up. And that's when I knew I didn't ask the question properly. Because I said, yes, Stefan? He said, motorcycle. Right? I said, no, Stefan, no machines. He said, oh, he was disappointed, his shoulders drooped. His hand went back up. I said, yes, Stefan? He said, bicycle. I said, no, Stefan, bicycle's a machine too. That was it. He was done for the lesson. He was right? But the other children kept thinking about it and thinking, and then all of a sudden, one of the quiet children in the back raised a hand and said, I can do it more quickly with my eyes. I look at the wall, I look at the fence, and I look back. Now that was the answer I needed. And I said, well, Gretchen, that's a great answer. But what if I didn't say the fence? What if I said the 1st grade playground that you can't see? How could you get there quickly? And the little girl sitting next to her said, in my imagination, I imagine the 1st grade playground, and I imagine myself back. And that was the starting point for the lesson. I said, okay, boys and girls, I want you to imagine. Imagine we're up above the school, like we were when we studied geography and we were mapping the whole playground. Imagine we're above the school, and now imagine we can fly. We're going to fly over the basketball courts. Look down, you can see them. We're flying over the 1st grade playground. Now we're going to fly over the Potomac River, and we're in Virginia. And we're just going to fly over Virginia, and we're going west. Now look up. You see the Blue Ridge Mountains? Those are the Appalachians. We're going to fly over those, over West Virginia. We flew all the way to the Mississippi River in our imagination, and we kept going. And because I'm a teacher, I couldn't resist saying, look down, you see that flat land? We're going to study that next year. That's the Midwest. And then over we went until we came to the Rockies. I said, look up. You see those mountains with the snow? Let's stop in front of them. Now look up. You see that piece that sticks out, that crag? Let's go up there. So we imagined ourselves standing on this crag. And I said, well, now look down. Do you see that nest? Look how big it is. I bet you that nest is about 6 feet across. And look how thick the branches are. They're as thick as your wrist. Oh, but look at the babies in there. You see those boys and girls. They're eagles, 3 little baby eagles. Oh, but listen, the mother's coming. You can hear her. Let's move out of the way. And then I described the mother eagle landing and how in her talons she held a fish. And I described the curve of her beak and how keen her eyes were and how she would reach down with her beak and tear the flesh off the fish and feed the babies. I said, you see how big her wings are? They're about 8 feet across. And do you see how she flew? Do you know how light an eagle is? It only weighs about 12 pounds. That's not much, boys and girls. You know that an eagle has air in its feathers? And it has air inside its bones. It even has little pockets of air in its body. It's just akin to the air. Oh, but children, watch now, the father's coming. Do you know that eagles mate for life and they always come back to their nest? Now, the father landed, we described what he looked like, and then he took off and rose on the currents of warm air, higher and higher, until he saw below him food. And he pulled in his wings, and he fell like a lightning bolt. And I said, boys and girls, do you know where you're like an eagle? It's in your thinking. In your thinking, you can soar to amazing heights. In your imagination, you can go from one place to another in an instant. In your thinking, you are like an eagle. And when I said that, and that was Dorothy Hara's lesson, it was like the light went on. And it's like that sign that's in your hallway in this new building, the one that says, human being, know thyself. That's what our education's all about. It's really about having children understand what it means to be a human being. That's an empowering thought. The kind of empowerment that the Native Americans would get from their totem animal, where you feel that the strength of that creature ennobles you, makes you greater, makes you stand taller than you would, now that you know that the power of an eagle is in your thinking. That's our job as teachers. You saw through that story, all the facts were there, right? How big an eagle's nest is, the average size of the number of babies that are born, how they're fed, how much an eagle weighs, how wide its wingspan is. What I didn't say to the children is how incredible an eagle's eyesight is. They say that if an eagle could read, it could read a paper from 1/4 of a mile away. Do you imagine if we saw like that? We read something on the plane yesterday about falcons. Falcons see so incredibly because 85% of their brain is devoted to vision. 85%. And a falcon can see a rabbit from a mile away. A rabbit. A mile away. That's astounding. If we could convey to our children how astounding our world is, now that they've been jaded into believing they know everything because they've watched the Discovery Channel and the nature programs. How do we teach them in a way that opens their heart? Teachers have an interesting assignment. We have to surprise our children. We have to come in through the back door, because if they see a lesson coming, they're not always so open. We want to surprise them, and how we teach makes all the difference. When you teach science in a Waldorf school, you do it through phenomena. The phenomena that you bring to the children instructs them. Now, I want to give you a little bit of an aside here. I often go to work with schools, and sometimes I work with parents who are interested in starting a high school. And I like to ask people questions, and the question I like to ask again and again is, what's your best memory? What's your best memory when you were an adolescent? And one of the men that was in a group I did in Massachusetts said, I was in a special class in New York where they were working with us. They took us to Columbia University on Saturdays to study science. And what they would do was they would show us phenomena. And they'd say, okay, find out what this is supposed to teach you. And that is a whole different experience in a child's soul than telling them what they're going to learn. I'll give you an example. You're teaching chemistry in 7th grade, and you're going to teach them about carbon dioxide and how it represses combustion and how, well, just the qualities of carbon dioxide. So you take a glass beaker, nice, beautiful pitcher, the kind you would use to serve lemonade in the summer, and you cover the bottom with sodium bicarbonate, and then you pour in acetic acid, and the whole thing fizzes. And in another beaker, you have a candle that's burning. And then you hold this pitcher, and you tilt it slightly, and all of a sudden, the candle goes out. Because this gas that you've created, it's so heavy that it just mysteriously sinks down into that beaker, and when it covers the flame, it extinguishes it. But then you say to the children, now, what was that? What did you see? That's a very different experience, because then they have to kind of work with it in their mind. But if you said to children, boys and girls, our lesson today, the goal of our lesson is to show that carbon dioxide is an invisible gas made through a combination of baking soda and vinegar, and it's heavier than air. So when they see that, it's like, so? What'd you expect? Right? We don't want the so. We want our children to be engaged through feeling. We want them to wonder. If you said to them, boys and girls, we're going to study today the qualities of magnesium when it burns and how bright it is. That's a very different soul experience than when in front of a child you take a ribbon of magnesium and you light it and you get this shocking white light. That moves them. That interests them. We want our children to be interested in the world. We want their thinking to be engendered out of an experience that garners their attention and out of an emotional response that asks for their full humanness. We don't want to give them just the facts. Teaching is about conveying ideas and facts to children, but our job is to do it in a way that we keep that wonderful nature of childhood alive in them while they learn. It's straight and curved. We want them to learn. We want them to write up their science demonstrations in an accurate way with good sentences and good punctuation and clear thinking. But we want to do it in a way that touches their heart. I was talking to a woman that I used to teach with, and she's teaching 4th grade, and she's going to teach this animal block. And she said, I remember when my daughter was in 4th grade, and she came home, and she went in the backyard, and she hung from the branch of a tree all afternoon because she had just studied the sloth. And any teacher who can inspire a child to come home and still live in that lesson. So I saw her teacher. You know, the girl's 24 years old now, so this is a teacher who had her 14 years ago in 4th grade. And I said, I heard this great story about one of your students that she went home, and not only when you taught about the horse did she go and eat grass in her yard because she wanted to taste it, but when you did the sloth, she hung from a tree all afternoon. He said, oh, you know what I did with them? I tied a rope from one tree to another, and all of the children had to be on that rope, and they had to move across the rope, but they only were allowed to move one finger at a time. Right? And that's teaching children where they really live, isn't it? That's their world. That's unforgettable. That's how we want to teach our children. We want to sew straight and curved together so that it really enkindles an interest in the world. Now, I want to mention something from the high school years because it has to do with the thinking, right? Because in high school, what the child is interested, the grade school child's interested in that the world is beautiful. They believe that. A high school child wants to know the world is true. That's different than beautiful, and it's different than good. And you see that when you talk to teenagers. They're realists. They see right through facades. They're perceptive, and they're keen, and they're often disappointed in what they see in the adult world. But we want them to be good thinkers, warm thinkers, not cynical. And that's a battle today. Our children are cynical. Who can you believe in? Right? So we had this boy in our school. He came in the junior year, transferred from a really good prep school called St. Anselm's, top school in the city. He was a senior. No, he's a junior, and he said to his mother, Mom, I don't know how much you're paying for the Waldorf school, but you're wasting your money. And she said, why is that? He said, because you know what? We've just been studying Hamlet, and do you know what they asked me? They asked me what I thought. Right? And she said, well, maybe that's just Mr. Hall. No, all the teachers want to know what I think. You see, he'd gone to a very good prep school. When you read Hamlet, the teacher put everything you were supposed to think about Hamlet on the board. Main character, main theme, conflict, author, all that information, you put it in your notes, and when you had a test, you answered all those questions. But to ask somebody, what do you think about Hamlet? Why was he dressed in black? Right? That should really stir something in an adolescent's soul. That should make them think. College professors complain that their students today won't think. They just want to know, what do I need to give you so I get an A? But they won't take the leap to be courageous thinkers. They won't say what they really believe. In a Waldorf school, we will ask the children that repeatedly. What do you think? Because by expressing what you think, you get to know who you are. And finding out who you are is so important. If you had a high school, you would get to talk to seniors. And when you talk to Waldorf seniors, it's so convincing the value of this education because they know who they are. I spent 4 years in college, well 5 actually, trying to find out who I wasn't. And I bet I'm not alone. But the Waldorf kids know who they are because the way they're educated moves them toward that understanding by asking them to think clearly about a wide range of subjects, and to do it actively and with the warmth of feeling. Because thinking, feeling, and willing, just like in The Wizard of Oz, those are important capacities for children to go into this complex world. Now, Dorothy, when a child knows who they are, when they have a sense that there's meaning in life, when they've been educated in this balanced spiritual way, they're going to feel at home wherever they are in the world. And that's what we want for our children. We want them to grow up to be young people that have these qualities. Our Waldorf graduates do. They have unique qualities. When you look what they do, the former head of American Express, Ken Chenault, was a Waldorf graduate. Went kindergarten through grade 12 at a school in New York. What they said about him when he was the president of American Express was that the moment he'd come in, he would talk to everyone in his company that he met on the way to his office, whether it was the man who cleaned the floors, or whether it was someone who worked as a clerk or in delivery of mail. He talked to them all, because this sense of the other is cultivated in this education. When the Twin Towers were destroyed, the American Express building was right across the square. What Ken Chenault said was that he gathered all his workers and he had to tell them 2 things. He had to tell them what actually had happened, and then he had to give them hope. You see that blending? That's truly human qualities. He brings that. The head of NATO is a former Waldorf student. It's wonderful to think of the qualities that he brings to that important work. The head of BET, Black Entertainment Television, is a Waldorf grad. The Waldorf grads bring something special. This summer, my wife and I worked in a camp, and the counselors, and a lot of them were Waldorf students. They bring qualities that are unique. There was one young woman there. She was in her senior year, and she was our granddaughter's counselor, so we got to see a lot of her. But one day I saw her sweeping the stairs down into the lower level where the art classes were. No one asked her to do that. She was taking a broom to help clean up downstairs, but she saw that the stairs were dirty, and so she swept them too. Her sense of responsibility was marked. How do you test for that? Can you test to see how much responsibility lives in the soul of a young person? Right? You can't. There's no pen and paper test for that? How can you assess the quality that a young person has to seek beauty in the world? You can't test for that. How can you test for kindness? To see whether someone is really going to have empathy for another human being. Now, I know there are things that we should assess, and I believe in testing my kids. And if you ask anyone I taught, they would tell you I've tested them. Because I want to make sure that the education they get academically is comprehensive and thorough and sound. But what I know is the real value of Waldorf education. We can't tell what we've given to our children. Because when you teach them in this way that weaves straight and curved together, you develop soul qualities that are important but ineffable. You can see them as they manifest through deeds, but we have no way of knowing the depth of these qualities. And yet I have confidence in our education, especially when it's supported by parents at home. I believe that together we can move mountains. When parents and teachers work together, it's magical what can happen. And our children need it today in a great way. They live in a complicated world. So, I have one other thing that I was going to say, but I'm going to save it. And I'm just going to take a pause here, breath, and I'm going to see what questions have come to you, or what questions have you brought with you that we can address at this point. What's the importance of the individual teacher, and how does their individuality affect the children that they teach? You know, we've had 3 of our children go through the Waldorf school, kindergarten to grade 12. They've had very different teachers. And if you asked me, I would say the teacher really makes an impact. I watch our daughter, and she has qualities that I think her class teacher had. You know, she works in a way that's just determined. And I watch our son, and he has a gentleness that I know his class teacher had. And then I watch our middle son, and he has a stubbornness that I know his class teacher had. But he also has a measured, reasonable intelligence that was a mark of his teacher. And a real devotion and loyalty to the people he loves. Yeah. So I see that a teacher leaves an impression on their children. What I know is that every teacher teaches differently, and the difference is a gift in a school if the teaching is done well. And that's what you want. And you want a school to support the teachers so that they can do their best work. And that you want to support them in a way that the fullness of their gifts manifest in a classroom. Now, having said that, I'll say that I've met some of the nicest human beings that weren't good teachers. And because they were nice human beings, they really wanted to do this work out of idealism, and they wanted to do it in a way that served children. Do you teach?
Not children.
Okay. Well, here's what happens in a classroom. I was in a school in Alberta. Sweet man, teaching 5th grade, and I was there to observe him. And it was his first year, and the children came into his classroom, and they were sitting down, and the lesson was about to start, probably 2 minutes after it was ready to start. And one child raised a hand and said to the teacher, "May I go to the bathroom?" And I was sitting there thinking, say no. Just say no. But he was very kind, much kinder than I am in a classroom. He said, "Do you really have to go?" And the student said, "Yeah." And he said, "Okay, you go." And then 3 other hands went up, right? You see? And you can't teach that. You know, you can say to someone, "Don't be so nice," just tell them no. Then the children went to the bathroom, then another child said, "You know, Adrian next to Billy is absent, this desk is empty, can I sit next to Billy?" And I thought, just say no. And he said, sure, come sit up here. And of course, the child talked the whole time. You see, some people are just too nice to be good teachers. You know, you have to say, look, don't go to the bathroom, just cross your legs. We're going to be here another 10 minutes, and then we'll be done. You know, no, you don't have to get a drink right now, you know. And so I don't know how you train that into, you know, that not niceness, but I got it in my education. I don't know, you know. But it often has to do with, when they say, what are good teachers' qualities? It's they're passionate about what they teach. They love what they teach. They're excited when they teach. I ask people, what was your best teacher like? And they're always different. You know, I thought my best teacher saw who I was. You see, so quiet observation. I thought my teacher was the best because I never knew what they were going to do. Sometimes they stood on their desk to teach and got, you know, the whole class excited. And, you know, and it's always different, but it's heartfelt. And it's dedication, and those people are good teachers. And truly in a Waldorf school, we don't do it for the money. People are dedicated, and they do it because you love to learn and be with children. You really get an education. So I hope that's a realistic answer to your question, and a satisfactory one.
How do you think the education system, Waldorf education system, how has it changed? How it's remained the same? How is it keeping pace with the time?
Surely. I'll give you an example right out of my 7th grade physiology block. When I wanted to teach my children about digestion, I taught them this. It starts in your mouth when you're eating your food. Chew it up with your teeth. Yeah, chew it up good. Break it up into pieces, lots and lots of bits, then get it all wet, all covered with spit. Yeah, saliva, secretion. It helps with digestion, but there's one thing I forgot to mention, the tongue. Oh, yeah, the tongue. Oh, yeah. Move it to the left, move it to the right, move it to the roof and break it down and out of sight, then swallow that food and let it go down. But remember, don't talk. Don't make a sound, because the epiglottis, it has to move around or else you'll choke and fall to the ground. I say dead. Yes, that's what I said. I said dead. So teaching digestion through rap, that was my dream as a teacher. That was my dream. And it came true. I taught a course one summer up in Maine, and I confessed after my 3rd class, I said, you know, as class teachers, you always have regrets. You finish in 8th grade and you wish, oh, I wish I'd done that. And I always wished I'd written a rap song for digestion. Well, there's a young man in my class from Minnesota, and Jason Bernstein, great guy. He writes to me 2 years later. He said, you know what? I wrote that rap song. I said, well, you send it to me. And he sent me a little file, music file. And when I got to 7th grade, I thanked him, and I taught that to my kids, and they loved it. And you think they remember everything? They absolutely do. Yeah. So you want to change, but what we know is you want to teach them through feeling. And with the adolescent, you want to teach them through music. Music is so important to the adolescent, and they love to sing, and they love to sing in harmony. That just soothes them, and they sing beautifully. And those high school counselors that we met, they sang in 4-part harmony. I watched those high school kids, and I thought, they have so many capacities that are admirable. They have incredible potential, you know, because you develop all these different sides to them. One of the things, I used to coach baseball at our high school, and we'd come home from our baseball games in spring, and you come out on a Friday night and the sun is shining and it's 70 degrees. It's just great, especially if you've won. Everybody's happy. And we're taking all the equipment out of our van and putting it in the sports locker outside. And I go to the van, and one of my boys, my catcher, is singing. He's singing opera. I thought there's not another coach in Washington, D.C. that has a catcher that sings opera. Right? He was an all-Met catcher. He's a good baseball player, and he's a great kid. He went on to be an architecture major at University of Virginia, and he's now an architect in New York City. But that diversity of abilities, that he could play baseball, be a great student, and sing opera, that's a kind of a picture of what Waldorf kids take away from their education. And that's something that Steiner believed 100 years ago, and it's still valuable today. So you always have to see what's the basis that we want to continue, and how do we manifest it in ways that are current, right? Yep.
You ended your talk talking about parents and teachers collaborating together. Can you speak to how you've seen that play out, and for better or for worse, or how you encourage parents and teachers to work together?
Yes. Well, two things. One is, I feel it's important that we always feel, as parents and teachers, that we're speaking about the same child, right? Because our view of what a child needs should be compatible. Parents see much more of a child than we do as teachers, but we have a perspective on the child where we see them with their peers, and so we see a different side. And when we put those two together, we should feel like, I know the child you're talking about. And the thing that I've found is that when parents feel that the teacher really sees their child, they're reassured. And the other piece is that we should understand what the work of the school is trying to do. And so we should both want that. The parents should want this education that's going to develop the children in a well-rounded way. And we should agree on certain principles with that we're going to teach them through activity, and that's why we have these main lesson books. And we're going to teach them through feeling. That's why we teach so much through story and art. But we're going to do it so that in the long run, when their thinking wakes up, we're going to really have thinking that's warm, heartfelt, and dynamic, because it's come in that way. And you want parents to feel like, all right, it may not be exactly the way I do it, but let's watch and see. And then they'll see whether their child seems happy at school and engaged and giving their best and growing. But I'll tell you a secret. We had 3 children go to the Waldorf school, 2 boys and a girl. The boys, how was school? It was fine. What'd you do today? I don't know. Played hockey out at recess. They got good education, but that was what they tell me. Our daughter, she'd have a litany of everything that was wrong. And I thought, wow, you mean the parents in my class, this is what they've heard? I thought any parent who has a daughter that goes to our school should get a medal if they stay for 8th grade. Right? Because our daughter had all these things to say, and we knew she had the best teacher. Just the best teacher. Oh, but she could see everything that wasn't perfect. And, as a parent, you have to have faith. Right? You do. Because your children just going to play it the way they want when they get to be 12 and 13 and 14. So you have to have faith. Yeah. Yeah. So it's trust and it's working together, but it's really the parent education. And, I worked a lot with the dads in our community. We're going to have a dads group tomorrow night. And one of the things that I want the dads to know is you need to understand this education. Right? You don't need to understand it exactly the way someone tells you to, but you need to understand it on your own terms. And so you have to read. And that's why I just would encourage the dads. We had a study where we read a book on Waldorf education together, and just to feel like they could just ask their questions too, so they know what this is education's trying to do. It wasn't trying to tell them what to think. It was just to let them experience this and raise the questions they had with each other. Yeah. So I know what I wanted to say then, the last thing that I wanted to share with you. Tomorrow, there's a big hearing in D.C., right, for this nomination for Kavanaugh and this testimony. Kavanaugh went to high school in our neighborhood. Georgetown Prep, where both Kavanaugh and Gorsuch went, is less than 3 miles from our house. It's a prestigious, elite private school. And at schools like that, they just assume that the character you want to convey to your students will occur through the quality of their fellow students, who are all elite. And that this quality will manifest itself in high SAT scores, high GPAs, and good colleges. And what's clear from what's going on with Kavanaugh is that's probably not enough. Our high schools need to ask more of our students. We need to ask for a development of soul life as well as academic life. We need to see that our children have a moral compass that guides them, so that when they do, you know, what is it that the Harvard students used to chant when they played football? You know, oh, well, it's okay, you'll all work for us someday, right? Stanford students chanted that too. All the elite colleges see themselves as the future business leaders. Don't we want them to have qualities of soul that are admirable? You can't have that if your education isn't integrated. If you haven't woven straight and curved together through grade school into high school, you get a disconnect. And then people separate what they feel from what they think. And they make decisions that are based on one aspect alone. And those decisions often affect other human beings in a negative way. Whether they're business decisions to stop giving medical coverage so you only hire people for 37 hours a week, or they're the selling off of pensions when a company is taken apart, or they're military decisions that feel that certain number of casualties are accepted, or whatever. And I don't think, I'm not bringing this up as a political question as much as an educational question. How do we educate full human beings? The Dalai Lama would bring his monks to the University of Wisconsin for research on compassion. And they would do brain scans and MRIs to see what was going on in the brain when these monks meditated. Were brains changing because of meditation? And one day they were trying to do a study on compassion. And so they had one of the monks connected to all these electrical wires, and he had a hairnet on over them so they'd stay in place. And he was about to get into the MRI chamber, and the other monks started laughing. And the professor who ran the lab said, "Do you think he looks funny?" And they said, "No. We're just trying to understand why, if you want to measure compassion, you have the wires on his head and not his heart." You see? And that's what we want to make sure, that we educate our children in their feeling life and their will life, because they're going to need strength in those capacities to find their way in the world we live in today, because it's gotten so complicated. Yeah.
Talk about teachers, but the children, how do they play into it?
Yeah. How do children deal with the struggles that they find in their school environment, in their school experience?
Yes, and then what relationship is that to their karma and the relationship with their teacher and their parents and maybe the value of that struggle?
Yeah. You know, that's such a complicated question, because it's so individual. You know, who can say what a child's karma is? I can't. But I know that our destinies move us in unusual ways. And I know that I believe that there's meaning in our human existence. And I always like to say this African saying, there are no accidents in the universe. Right? A friend of mine would say that, and I love that, because I believe that. So if a child has a difficulty, I think, what's the meaning of this? But also, if it's in my class, what's my responsibility with that? How do I help a child who's being mean to another child? How do I protect a child who's being picked on by another child? I think all I can say is what I've learned as a teacher is walk toward it. It's not going to go away. And that's what I've told myself again and again and again. Walk toward it. Ask, sit down, talk. My last class, we had so many talking circles where children, I would ask them, okay, what happened? What was going on? Let's talk about it. And they would all, really, out of empathy for each other, add good things. So that has to be part of the process. Whether we like it or not, antisocial behavior has increased. And so children just, they're harder on each other, on their parents, on their teachers, on everybody, on themselves. And we have to help them. And interest in the other is a remedy for that. So we have to help children pay attention to others. When I took my last class, people would say, have children changed? What's your new class like? And I'd say, oh, my new class, I teach sons. I have a whole class of sons. They said, what, you have only boys? I said, no. I have children who think they're the center of the universe and everything revolves around them. And that's how our children are today. You know, how are you going to be if someone takes your photo 20 times a day? You're going to think you're important, right? And if you sit at the dinner table and you say something and everybody stops because you've interrupted their conversation and they turn to you because you're the voice of wisdom, you're going to think you're important. So the children that I taught, they all had good things to say. But it took them 3 years to learn to listen to each other. But once they did, that developed a human quality and an interest in the other that never went away. And they stayed close through the years. But you have to cultivate that as a teacher. You have to cultivate it so that when someone reads their composition, everybody listens. And that when they have something to say, it's constructive. And you have to look at the expressions on faces where someone dismisses somebody just in their expression, and you have to call them on it. And that's part of what we have to do as teachers. Make sure you're listening. You know? I was in a school, an inner city school, where the teacher said, do you see that girl standing at the blackboard? She's beautiful. Would you put your eyes on her? That's what she said to the boy who was screwing around during her presentation while she was doing a math example on the board. I love that because she saw immediately. Or the teacher who taught in an inner city school when the children had to line up for a fire drill and the boy wouldn't hold the hand of the girl. And she just stopped and she wouldn't go and she said, why won't you take her hand? You have to call children on things today. And that's important. So that's a struggle, but you know whose struggle it is? It's often the adult's struggle, right? To make these things happen. And truth be known, things that struggle grow stronger, right? We see that in our physical nature. You break an arm and it's in a cast for 6 weeks and it's no pressure on it at all. It gets weak. But when it's free of that cast and you use it, it pushes against things that don't move, it holds things that are too heavy, and it gets stronger. Grapes, they grow sweeter when they grow in rough soil. All people who run these grape vineyards know that. Clams, or oysters with pearls, it's from that grain of sand. And so we see these parables in our natural world. We know that when children struggle, they get stronger. And yet as parents, it's the hardest thing to watch our children struggle. You know, and that's our test too. How do we let them struggle? How do we let them fall? I was at a talk once where the woman who was giving a talk said, how many of you are over 40? And the people raised their hands. She said, you should all be dead. Because you rode your bicycle without a bike helmet. You roller skated without knee pads and elbow pads. You drank out of your garden hose. Right? Children had struggles. And they did things. And they scraped their knees. And they got up and they came home. And the parents had to put Band-Aids on. But they fell and got up. And what people will write is that those struggles inoculate children from the problems in life. We want them to struggle because it builds their resistance and it helps them be resilient You know, the one thing we know is all our children will have problems in life. They'll know somebody they love who's ill. They might experience divorce. They might experience violent crime. They might have their house broken into, their car stolen, their job taken away. That's just part of life today. How do we weather those storms? We want resilience. We have to grow that with our children in a loving way. We have to let them fall and let them pick themselves up. We have to let them do that. It's important. Makes them stronger. I've been wanting to write an article which says, "Make Americans great again," because I don't think we're raising children to be strong today. And I think we should.
Well, I agree with you. I think that those sometimes are the wounds that really sting children, and how that squares with my understanding of Waldorf theory on discipline is to let children work it out themselves. And you're sort of advocating not doing that in a way, and so this probably is just my own misunderstanding.
No, it's probably the way I expressed it, because I believe that a teacher should play a role. And from everything I read and the people I hear, like Kim Payne, I know that's what he asks teachers to do. But I would think that my answer didn't give a full picture, because there are things that you let children work out. And so it's both. And that, back to your question, is what makes teaching so hard. I remember standing with a teacher who was having difficulties, and I'm saying, you know, you really need to see what children are doing. But what I realized after I said that was there's so many things a teacher has to ignore. And how do you know what you see and pay attention to and what you ignore? You know, you can't teach that. That's an art. And how do you know when to be firm and when to be loving? You know, that's an art. It's like polarities that we're working with, but we do it through love. And it's not that we don't make mistakes. You know, teaching is like parenting. By that I mean, you can do 10 things right, and if you do one thing wrong, that's all you think about that night when you're going over your day, right? And so as a teacher, I learn much more from my mistakes, because they make me feel regret, and they make me resolve to do better. And so you just figure it out. But what I figured out was, when I get to 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, I have to walk closer to children when there's a problem. And what I know is when I teach 1st and 2nd grade, there are little things that happen that I don't say anything about. You know, the boy who touches someone, the girl's next to him's crayons one time too many, and she hits his hand, and I think, good. I'll ignore that. Right? Okay. Well, thank you all. You've been a very patient audience. Thank you.